On the 10th day, the air stopped moving. No wind, no insect chorus, no chimney smoke rising. By nightfall, entire rooms had gone still, as if the sound had been taken out of them by hand. San Lazaro sat in the hollow of the Mall Valley like a dry palm cupped against a flat sky. 34 clay homes, one low chapel, a schoolroom with chalk still on its board. It looked ordinary from the ridge. Tile roofs, a scattering of fruit trees, a thin ribbon of rail where a late afternoon train sometimes rattled past. But ordinary bent when they walked into it. Ordinary split and left a bare, blank shape where life should have been. The telegram came from the rail junction at 1943 on March 10th. Temperature falling fast, air shimmering above rooftops. Silence too heavy. Something wrong with the light. 2 minutes later, the line went dead. The operator in Talca filed the message away as a containment note. The file would later be corrected and the entry altered. For those who visited the village, there was no bureaucratic comfort to hide behind. They found things that did not belong in any report. The first inspection party arrived 10 days later. 2 men with maintenance kits, a foreman, and a photographer whose camera still smelled of developer. They expected collapse or flood, a plasterfall or an animal stampede. They found instead a stillness that had form. Doors were closed from the inside, but nothing had been forced. Pots sat on ranges, noodles dried in shallow cracks. Plates held the ghost of salt. Spoons were placed beside them as if their hands had never moved to lift. The beds were pressed down, pillows shaped as if someone had just risen, blankets smoothed and folded with care. No bodies, no footprints departing, no sign the village had been emptied by flight or fire. In the chapel, candles had liquefied and flowed in pale rivers over the flagstones, congealed glass where once flame had been. The bell rope hung slack. The bell itself fused into its iron frame with a crust of white residue, as if it had been weathered from the inside. Morales, the eldest inspector, closed his eyes at the doorway and said later that the room smelled faintly of iron and of something sweet he could not name. A memory of orchard bloom or of blood, indistinct. He touched the pew and it was warm, not in the way warm meant fire, but in the way of something that had been held steady by breath. When their cigarettes were lit, the smoke did not climb. It hung and coiled in thin filaments, as if underwater. They photographed the interiors. Every negative returned a strange doubling, a blurred echo across the frames. In one photograph, the priest's missal lay open, the page written twice over itself in slightly different angles. In another, the schoolroom chalkboard held the phrase El aire recuerda in white strokes, and the letters seemed to tremble like the surface of pond water after a stone is dropped. Their watches misbehaved. A pocket watch stopped at 3:41 a.m. and refused to move again until 10 minutes later, then stopped on the same second the following midnight. These were oddities Morales wrote into his log with a careful hand. Later, he would underline the line about the clock 3 times. At night, around their camp 2 kilometers away where they had refused to sleep inside the village, the men said they could hear breathing, not the small rhythm of 2 lungs, but a sound that moved like a tide. A soft intake, a hollow pause, a long exhale, 10 seconds, then repeat. Jimenez, who had a habit of humming to keep his hands steady, sat bolt upright and swore the hum he heard inside the static was a voice saying, "Despierta, wake up," over and over like a bad recording left on loop. They left with photographs, samples of dust gathered in vials, and reports typed in the late night that would be stamped and shelved. Temporary closure, local hysteria, no cause determined. 2 of the men refused to return to field duty. One kept his lighter in a drawer and said that the flame went out as if the lighter itself had been asleep. Morales kept having the same dream for 2 months. A chapel where the bell struck but no sound came forth, only a ripple in the air you could feel on your teeth. Years later, when word of the retracted column surfaced, a geologist named Arturo Medina, mapping for copper seams in 1961, stumbled across San Lazaro by accident, following a line of scrub and a wrong GPS fix. He wrote, without melodrama but with a precise unease, that the site appeared as if someone had laid it down by memory rather than memory by place. Identical rooftops, identical fences, as if a hand copied the village and set it again on the soil. He camped 2 nights and recorded a faint, rhythmic tremor at dawn that he insisted was not the earth, but the air itself, a low frequency like the hollow of a drum, rising and falling at intervals of 10. Medina's notebooks, later found locked in a box in a university archive, were peculiar. Half the pages were blank. The pages that contained writing ended mid-sentence. On one such line, under a smear of ink, someone had pressed in graphite as if to mark a sentence unfinished. They are not dead. They are asleep, and the air remembers their breath. The phrase was not scientific. It read like a witness testimony translated into a laboratory note. In 1973, a cartographer, Elena Rojas, was assigned to update topographical charts. She took systematic readings, barometric, soil, compasses. At first, she recorded dry numbers and the habitual crisp notes of a young scientist. Time, coordinates, soil pH. By the second week, the journal's handwriting shrank and tightened. She catalogued small details that would mean nothing to most men. Dust that clung to brass in circular motifs. Compass needles that vibrated when placed near the schoolyard threshold. A watch that halted every morning at 3:41 and would only resume with a deliberate tap on the glass. On day 15th, she scrawled, "Daylight is wrong. The horizon blurs like a photograph rubbed with a thumb." When her supervisor arrived, he found her sitting on the chapel step, hands folded, maps unopened beside her. She did not look in his direction. Her eyes tracked some invisible line along the skyline. Her field recorder was still running, its reels stamped with static. The final recording he would later listen to in private contained a single phrase repeated with soft cadence. They never stopped dreaming. Elena was admitted to a hospital in Talca the next day under a diagnosis of catatonic persistence. Nurses charted a breathing rate that slowed to 5 breaths per minute, though pupils reacted normally. She slept like someone halfway underwater. After 3 weeks, she mumbled one sentence and insisted on her maps. She traced a finger over the coordinate of San Lazaro and in a voice thin as paper said, "It moved." Maps changed thereafter. Where San Lazaro had been a settled point, the contour lines shifted, as if the land had rearranged itself in the night. Miners surveying the terrain later would mark peculiar depressions and then erase them, replacing them with blank grid squares. An inspector who returned in 1975 found the road to the village overgrown as if it had not been used in decades. Satellite photographs, when they came into play decades later, would show, briefly and only at dawn, a set of concentric rings in the plaza. Faint geometric impressions like the growth rings of a tree carved into the earth. At the center, a rectangle the size of a chapel, a dark absence in the morning glare. Sound recordings pulled from later investigations refused to be stable. A reel labeled Region 7, unidentified audio, was donated anonymously to a small museum in Talca in 1991. When technicians attempted to digitize it, machines failed. Tape heads scraped. Amplifiers tripped. A technician later described what he heard before the machine died. A low hum threaded with something that resolved into syllables when slowed. A breath made into rhythm. A message rendered as air. In one fragment, a chorus seemed to speak in time. El aire recuerda. The digitized copy was corrupted. The original sealed and labeled unstable. Journalists came, some with skepticism and cameras, others with lanterns and thin notebooks. One radio host took a crew to broadcast live. His signal dropped out after 30 minutes. When it returned, his voice was tremulous and his last transmission was cut by static. His car was found abandoned that night, engine warm, the headlights blinking like a drowned eye. The tape of the broadcast sits in an evidence locker with a note. Unreliable. Corrupted through playback. There were those who tried to explain it away. Mass hysteria. Toxic gas exposure. A meteorological oddity. Each explanation collapsed under the weight of evidence that refused to behave like evidence. The bread dried in the kitchens as if frozen mid-process, but the wells still held water, and organs of caged animals remained fresh in a way that did not fit decomposition curves. Photographs duplicated with slight offsets. Audio coils rearranged themselves when read. Maps changed their contour over months without physical proof of erosion. It was as if a field of measurement had been quietly reprogrammed. For the investigators who lingered beyond caution, the valley's mechanism became a pattern. 10 days, 10 breaths, 10 cycles, from one record to another, a recurring integer folded into event logs and private notes. They noticed the rhythm not as a superstition, but as a measurable periodicity. Instruments registering a wave at roughly 1 cycle per 10 seconds. Seismic readouts showing faint atmospheric oscillations timed at 10-second intervals. Eyewitness testimony noting an inhale and a pause that conformed over and over again. The valley had a grammar, and it spoke in 10. People who listened too long found their own breathing dragged into that cadence. Some woke up with their hearts measured against a stranger's metronome. Those who wrote about it were careful with words, if they wrote at all. Those who did not write returned with the look of people who had been asked to remember something they had never learned. Eyes fixed, mouths slightly open, hands that hesitated over cups and clocks. When the maintenance party's report was filed, it concluded with administrative restraint, temporary closure pending further evaluation. The column in La Nación that briefly cited the event used the dull language of municipal oddity. The follow-up correction excised the entire entry. Later researchers would spend nights hunting down library copies to find that one mention. They would scratch their heads when archival boxes revealed nothing but air where one expected paper. Records, too, seemed to answer the valley's logic. Some pages would be complete, others blank. Others ended midline as if a pen had been pulled away at speed. The first hook, that the air stopped and the village had gone to sleep, returned in different forms in the notebooks of those who tried to make sense of it. It became a test. If you stood too close to the ruin at 4 in the morning, if you kept still and quiet enough, the breath of the valley caught you. Time thinned. A clock seemed to trap its second hand into a 10-beat loop. That was the thing the men who began the record noticed and could not report without sounding like charlatans. It was the thing the printed page refused to hold. On the ridge above San Lazaro, the evening sky was a thin sheet of pale pearl. Below, the houses waited as if for hands to lift them back into motion. If there was an answer inside that stillness, it was not immediate. It did not arrive like a thunderbolt or a confession. Instead, it spread, slow and patient, into the instruments of men who measured it, into the pages that recorded it, into the way the valley made the world adjust itself around absence. It lodged in the throat of anyone who crossed the line and listened. They called it Expediente 214M, in a basement room of the ministry, a file stamped with neat ink and a ribbon of bureaucratic apathy. The heading read, Atmospheric Irregularities, Region 7. Inside the envelope were the photographs from the first party, the maintenance men's typed statement, and a single handwritten note from Morales. Do not sleep near the chapel. That note, more than any official log, passed from desk to desk with a kind of furtive respect. Men who had never gone near the valley kept it folded inside drawers like a talisman they did not understand. The formal team arrived 11 months after the telegram. 6 professionals dispatched from Santiago under a neutral title, Survey and Structural Assessment. They were engineers and a physician, 2 technicians, a driver, and reluctantly, a photographer called Salcido, who still believed in the honesty of film. A long truck carried steel rods, a black box radio, field microscopes, and a sense of procedure that could be measured in lists. The ministry supplied forms. The men provided method. They entered San Lazaro at dawn, their boots finding the same dust that the maintenance crew had reported. The village looked, at first glance, as if frozen by neglect rather than calamity. Tiles intact, the paint slightly lifted at corners, pots on stoops with flaky residue of food. But the deeper they walked, the more the scene refused to obey expectation. Plates remained clean where a hand should have been. The hearths were cold, yet the iron kettles bore the polished mark of recent use. A child's shoe lay overturned and unsoiled as if it had been set down in protest and never reclaimed. The sense of time, if it could be called that, skewed sideways. Minutes in San Lazaro felt dense, loaded with the kind of patience one expects from stones, not human attentions. Dr. Varela, the assigned physician, began a catalogue the way a surgeon lists instruments. He checked pupils, measured capillary refill, tested breathing. Vital signs were peculiarly normal in the sense that they refused the narrative of collapse. The rooms held the traces of movement without movement. Beds retained impressions, as if the bodies had stepped out for a moment and been asked to return. On the wall of one house, a ceramic crucifix tilted slightly. Its shadow split into two like a duplicated thought. The air inside houses carried a faint metallic undercurrent. Dr. Varela wrote the word iron and then underlined it twice, as if underlining might convert intuition into evidence. They set up instruments in a methodical square on the school's dirt yard. A barometer, a basic seismograph, a microphone with windshield, and a long strip of photographic film. The technician in charge of soil samples, Rojas, scraped at the threshold where the footpath met the lime. Fine particles rose and clung in patterns she later sketched. Small, concentric arcs, as regular as ripples. Her field notes would show, in careful shorthand, the circular motif repeated like a punctuation mark. At night, while the men slept in tents pitched beyond the school as though the village itself demanded distance, the instruments began to behave in ways instruments are not supposed to behave. The barometer registered pressure oscillations that had no relation to the weather station a few miles distant. The seismograph produced a gentle waveform, not ground tremors but a wave in the air itself, measured at periods of roughly 10 seconds. The audio pickup, set deliberately to record ambient noise, produced a faint, low-frequency rhythmic thrum beneath the hiss. Too low for full hearing, but defined and consistent. An inhalation that swelled and subsided in 10-second cycles. Rojas later wrote in the margin, "Not wind, breath." The radio, left to monitor AM interference, captured an odd behavior at 2:17 AM. A low hum that shifted in phase as if streaming from a cavity, not the atmosphere. Jimenez, who kept a small tape recorder against his chest as reassurance, later said the hum had texture. When slowed, it resolved into syllabic intervals. In his later private note, he wrote one word in Spanish and underlined it as if it explained everything. Despierta. Wake. The word, when replayed, was not clean. It emerged like a voice filtered through glass. The tape itself yielded to the men inconsistently. Some reels produced a single long inhalation and then recorded nothing, while others returned an echo doubling where voices overlapped themselves by fractions of a second. Salcedo's camera, when developed that week, showed a series of frames where shadows were offset a mere millimeter from the objects that produced them, an optical ghosting that no lensman could accept as accident. The psychological effect upon the team was immediate and sustained. Small irritations became premonitions. Rojas misread her compass by 11 degrees when approaching the schoolyard. A simple lunch became a long exercise in avoidance, as if the act of chewing was being observed by more than hunger. They called home in the evenings to relay progress. The voices back in Santiago sounded bright and very far away. One of the technicians, Arevalo, left a bar of soap in his tent and after sleeping, found the soap placed neatly at the tent's entrance, as if some invisible hand had set it there to mark the night's end. He refused to talk about where he had been when he woke. His handwriting on the report forms became thinner in the latter entries. On the third night, Jimenez did not return to camp at dawn. His cot was unmade, his flashlight lying at the edge. They found his footprints leading a short distance into the field, set heavy in circular arcs, and then ending cleanly, as if someone had stood up and been lifted. The last marked step had the dirt compressed with a perfect symmetry, a small depression shaped like a palm. There was no blood, no sign of struggle. Morales refused to accept a rescue mission. It was too close to the village. They burned the remaining samples and left with an emergency dispatch stamped, "Withdrawal for safety reasons." The formal report they filed used neutral language: environmental instability, temporary closure, further assessment required. But their personal notebooks contained other sentences, written in the margins. They were not walking. They were dreaming, standing up. Back in Santiago, photographs that had been sealed inside a darkroom freezer degraded unpredictably. Salcedo's negatives showed a doubling in exposure that the development lab could not explain. A ghost frame superimposed with an offset that matched none of the known camera operations. A strip of film from the chapel door, examined under magnification, revealed a faint spiral pattern across the emulsion, a concentricity that mirrored Rojas's dusty arcs. The pathology lab, when presented with dust samples, recorded organic fibers that defied classification. Translucent filaments, pliant, almost membrane-like, that clung together in lattices. A young technician named Castillo swore in his notes that when a fragment was placed under a microscope and the light adjusted, the The pattern seemed to pulse once and then settle. Officials argued. The ministry proposed a panel: geologists, acousticians, and atmospheric chemists. Hypotheses were drafted in the sterile grammar of committees: methane pockets, subterranean fissure resonance, mass psychogenic illness. Each theory required equipment and time, and the concession that perhaps the valley had simply confounded simple explanation. The military quietly recommended restriction and reclassification. They called for maps to be revised. The cartographers obliged, with a pale smudge replacing the site on later prints. Yet the perimeter that the men had left behind continued to exert influence. A neighbor in Retiro, an old woman who sold eggs to the city twice a week, told journalists later that on some mornings you could hear the faint echo of schoolchildren reciting lessons across the valley, as if the voices had been preserved in a jar and were now being opened. She said the echo would cycle in and out, 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off, like a clock being started and stopped by an invisible thumb. The journalist who chronicled her report did so with a caution that would become predictable. The piece ran late at night and was buried under market news the following morning. Between laboratories and local memory, the pattern hardened. 10 seconds per cycle, 10 days between the first and the deepest shift. 10 years echoed in scattered mentions across private correspondence. The number ceased to feel accidental. A notation in Medina's field book, made by hand in 1961, repeated the sequence like a litany. 10, 10, 10. Those who encountered it felt, in ways difficult to measure, the alteration of their own breathing. Several men reported waking with their lungs constricted, as if they had been practicing a pattern during sleep, as if the valley had taught new cadences of inhale and exhale. A different phenomenon emerged in the aftermath, evidence that did not remain static under human attention. Paper blurred in places where notes had been written. Sentences ended mid-line as if a thumb had wiped them away. Even electronic devices, in later decades, seemed to prove unreliable near the coordinates. Recorders corrupted, drives rewrote sectors into zeros. Technicians called it instability in cold reports and then, privately, added their own words. Unstable material. Do not expose. The Museum of Telka received boxes marked Unstable. Region 7. Their archivists, practical people, developed superstitions about opening the crates. At its core, the official investigation revealed not a solution, but a transmission. The valley had a percussion, a pulse that resisted the usual instruments of inquiry. Each attempt to measure hardened the phenomena or redirected it. The more the men attempted to catalog, the more the evidence behaved like a living ledger. Pages that would blank themselves, sounds that would rearrange their magnetic particles when played, film that doubled its exposures without apparent cause. It was, as Dr. Varela later wrote in a private note, a physical stubbornness, as if reality itself refused the category. He would say aloud in the privacy of a hospital corridor years later, "It is not that nothing happened. It is that whatever happened prefers not to be caught." The team's withdrawal, the tentative folding of reports into sealed files, and the gradual erasure of San Lazaro from maps read like bureaucratic containment. But containment did not end the force. Items out of place, a plate, a bell rope, a child's shoe, kept surfacing in recollection and in private photos that leaked to those who would not rest. The valley's grammar, once heard, had a tendency to be repeated. 10 beats, a hush, the return of something like breath. The investigators left the field with forms filed and samples burned, and with the deeper, unfiled knowledge that they had witnessed a phenomenon that measured its increments in the lung space between seconds. If the first block had been the arrival and the establishment of the hook, the air stopping, the village sleeping, the second block thus became the slow, methodical taking of measurements that only ever seemed to confirm the impossibility. The men who came with instruments left with fewer certainties but with a new kind of data. The valley marked not by bodies or scorch, but by rhythm. Rhythm that did not belong to human biology, but that, disturbingly, could fold human biology into its own cadence. When the government files were sealed, Morales tore out a single page of his log and hid it in the lining of his jacket. On cold nights, he would slide that paper out and read the single sentence he had written in a hand made rough by fear. "If you stand very still, the valley will count you." He never explained what he meant. He only kept the page and would not, in the end, sleep inside a house again. By the early 1970s, the story of San Lazaro had already drifted into the kind of bureaucratic half-memory that clings to archives no one truly wants to open. Most of the men from the original investigation had died, retired, or forgotten their own notes. Only the name remained, Expediente 214M, printed on brittle paper and filed under atmospheric irregularities, between reports of mild drought and a case of migratory bird collapse. When the Chilean Geological Institute began its cartographic renewal program in 1973, the valley reappeared almost by accident. A young cartographer named Elena Rojas was assigned to remeasure terrain deformations after a mild tremor had been reported near the Mole Basin. She was meticulous, quiet, and largely uninterested in myths. Her notebooks from that year, later recovered from the Institute's storage, begin like any other field record. Precise, unpoetic, a clean hand, keeping time. Day 1. Coordinates verified. Dust light. Magnetic response low. No wind activity recorded. Day 2. Noticed silence between slopes. Can hear own heartbeat when still. Day 3. Compass drift 8 degrees. Adjusted magnet. Drift persists. Day 5. No insects. Temperature constant. Air feels thick, pressurized. Her field partner, a technician named Vargas, later said she was the kind of person who trusted measurements more than impressions. But by the end of that week, her entries had changed. Her pen strokes grew smaller, tighter, as though she were afraid the air might overhear what she was writing. Day 9 found thin crust over soil, translucent, flexible, soft as skin. When lifted, it vibrates like a membrane, broke under lens light. Day 10, sleep disturbed, felt weight on chest, not dream, physical. My heart followed slow pattern, 10 seconds between pulses. Checked watch. It had stopped again at 3:41. The phenomenon, the rhythmic pulse, would later appear in 3 different notebooks belonging to researchers who never met her. It was as if the air itself carried an internal clock that infected every observer's sense of time. On the morning of day 12, Elena recorded the first measurable anomaly. She placed a low-frequency sensor in the center of the valley and walked outward, counting steps. The recorder caught a continuous hum, steady, infrasound around 0.6 hertz, an oscillation so low it could be felt more than heard. The same frequency, decades later, would appear in naval sonar charts and in the resonance data from collapsed mines. But here it was free, suspended in open air. She logged it as persistent tone of atmospheric origin. Under the line, she wrote in smaller letters, "It sounds like breathing." Vargas dismissed it as a calibration error. He spent that evening repairing his barometer while Elena walked alone toward the chapel ruins. There was little left, just 4 stone walls and the outline of the bell mount fused by corrosion. She took photographs, measured dust density, and set a small mirror on the altar stone to mark wind direction. The mirror's reflection bent, shimmered, and then steadied, though the air remained still. Her notes from that moment are nearly illegible, written in strokes that press too hard into the paper. The reflection breathes, 10 in, 10 out. That night, the valley held a silence so absolute that it ceased to be silence. It was not absence, but pressure, as though sound had been pulled below the range of hearing. The tents rustled without wind. The canvas tightened and relaxed in a slow pattern. Vargas later told colleagues that he woke to the sensation of the earth expanding beneath him, the way lungs swell before a sigh. At 3:41 a.m., Elena's watch stopped again. She woke and turned on her recorder. The tape hissed, clicked, and filled with faint mechanical rhythm, short in, long out, until the reel ended. She played it back immediately. Underneath the static, her own voice could be heard counting breaths aloud, though she did not remember speaking. In the morning, she was pale, her eyes bloodshot as if she had been crying, though she denied it. Her field logs resumed, but the handwriting had changed. Slanted, hurried. Day 14. Sky pale blue before dawn, but sun not visible. Soil warm under feet. Found faint rings in dust, expanding outward. Each ring equidistant, 1.2 meters apart. Heard tone again, low, gentle, steady. Vargas cannot hear it. Day 15. Cannot distinguish dreams from waking. When I close my eyes, see outlines of houses. They shift slightly, like exhaling walls. The final page of her notebook contains no date, only a smudge of graphite and a single line. They are not gone. They are listening from beneath the air. When Vargas arrived at her tent the next morning, he found her seated on the chapel step. Her posture was upright, her eyes open, fixed toward the valley's far ridge. She did not blink. He called her name twice, then shouted. She did not respond. He noted that her breathing was visible but slow, 10-second intervals, chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. He lifted her wrist, pulse strong but distant, as though disconnected from rhythm. The tape recorder beside her knees was still spinning, the reel half full of silence. Back in Talca, she was admitted to the regional hospital. Doctors classified her state as catatonic persistence. Her body temperature remained normal, heart rate stable but halved, breathing exactly 6 per minute. She would stay like that for 21 days. The attending nurse described her expression as calm, not asleep, listening. She spoke once, 3 weeks later, when the neurologist played her a recording of the valley hum brought back by Vargas. As the tone filled the room, her pupils dilated and her voice emerged, flat but deliberate. It moved. After that, she did not speak again. The Institute's follow-up expedition recorded subtle alterations to the terrain. The ridges east of San Lazaro had shifted by several meters, though no landslides or erosions were reported. The soil analysis showed no structural displacement, no cause for the drift. The chapel walls now leaned outward by exactly 1 degree, an expansion rather than a collapse. The shape of the land itself seemed to have inhaled. Vargas wrote in his final memo, "Topography inconsistent. Geological drift impossible at this scale. Recommend site closure." He left the institute shortly after, taking Eleanor's compass with him. In his private notebook, found years later among his belongings, one sentence was underlined twice. The compass never settled again. Satellite imaging from 1975 confirmed what his report implied. The valley's coordinates no longer matched the surrounding map grid. The area, once a fixed square on the chart, appeared slightly displaced eastward by precisely 10 meters. The ministry attributed the error to survey misalignment and quietly removed San Lazaro from the next edition of official maps. No public notice was issued. The valley, once again, became unmarked, an unnamed hollow where sound refused to hold and maps refused to agree with memory. Years later, technicians calibrating seismic instruments in the Mall region picked up a repeating signal, subaudible, rhythmic. The pattern lasted 100 seconds each cycle, 10 beats, a pause, 10 again. It came from coordinates no longer listed on any Chilean map. In 1989, the archives of the Chilean Geological Institute were moved from their old colonial building in Santiago to a new facility built of concrete and glass, a shift meant to symbolize progress, precision, the age of computers. But when the archivists opened the sealed crates marked Region 7's, Retiro, Anomalo, they found water stains that hadn't come from water, film canisters that smelled faintly of metal, and envelopes of dust labeled unstable. One assistant, a student named Pablo Herrera, discovered a small tape reel with no identifying marks. Its label, faded and torn, bore only the word Rojas. He took it home out of curiosity, unaware that it was the original field recording from Eleanor's investigation 16 years earlier. The reel was brittle, the magnetic film flaking, but he threaded it carefully through his grandfather's reel-to-reel player. Static filled the room, thick, granular, as if sand were sliding through the speakers. Then, beneath that, something else, a tone low enough to feel in the ribs, rising and falling every 10 seconds. It was faint, yet precise, so consistent that he instinctively began breathing with it. His chest tightened when it dropped, relaxed when it rose, as though the air itself were conducting him. He leaned closer to the speaker and caught fragments that his brain wanted to call a voice. It was not speech, not quite, but phrased the way language sits just before it forms. He recorded the playback on a new cassette and brought it to his professor the next morning. By then, the reel had warped. The plastic had softened overnight, the sound degrading into a flat hiss. The cassette copy survived, though the sound on it seemed to change depending on who listened. Some heard breathing. Some heard words. One student heard a chorus of distant bells, out of rhythm. When analyzed through the university's new digital equipment, the waveform showed impossible symmetry. The hum was composed of 2 interlaced frequencies, one at 0, 6 hertz, the other at precisely 10 times that. The resulting image plotted on screen resembled an electrocardiogram. The technician who ran the test shut down the machine and refused to touch it again. He said the pulse in the waveform matched his own heartbeat. The recording was sent to a small museum in Talca for preservation. It arrived sealed in a cardboard box labeled Unstable Magnetic Media. For years, it sat in a climate-controlled drawer, its existence known only to the curator, who told colleagues that the player sometimes switched on by itself during power outages, though the plug remained disconnected. She laughed about it at first. Then she stopped mentioning it altogether. When the journalist Luis Carvalho, host of the late-night radio show Archivos del Sur, heard rumors of the recording, he called the museum directly. He had built his reputation on strange Chilean folklore, airfields that never existed, trains that arrived decades late, ghost towns mapped but never visited. The curator told him there was nothing to hear, but that was enough to make him drive south. He arrived in Talca with 2 assistants and a portable transmitter. The plan was simple: a live broadcast from the site of San Lazaro, a mix of folklore and science, entertainment for the sleepless. They carried a car battery, a field microphone, a shortwave radio, and a sense of excitement none of them would keep. The recording of that night, the one that aired, exists in fragments. The first half is ordinary: gravel under tires, nervous laughter, the host describing the valley. His voice is sharp, animated. Then, at minute 42, the tone shifts. There's a faint distortion, then static, then a breath that seems to come from inside the microphone. "We're close now. I think I see the chapel," Carvalho says. It's standing. God, it's still standing." His words distort again, stretch like tape played through a dying motor. A low hum bleeds into the signal. It pulses. 10 seconds, then 10 seconds of silence. The hum rises again. There's something. Wait, there's... Static floods the transmission. Then nothing. 3 minutes later, the broadcast resumes. His voice is different, monotone, quiet, each syllable separated by a faint inhale. "We found the chapel. The bell's gone. There are prints, fresh prints, all facing outward." The signal cuts once more. At dawn, a highway patrol found the crew's vehicle half submerged in a drainage ditch 30 kilometers from the valley. The engine still ran, headlights flickering weakly. The doors were open. The interior was covered in fine red dust. The radio hummed even after the power cables were removed. The broadcast tape recovered from the station logs contained an additional minute that never aired. In that minute, someone, Carvalho perhaps, whispered close to the microphone, "It's breathing. The whole ground is breathing." The museum denied ever lending the reel to the journalist. Official records listed the broadcast as transmission error due to atmospheric conditions. For months after, radio operators across central Chile reported interference at 0.6 hertz. The hum would appear just before dawn, drift across channels, and fade. Technicians called it subharmonic resonance, but one engineer wrote privately in a memo, "Not interference, synchronization." He never elaborated. In 1994, the phenomenon ceased as suddenly as it began. No one noticed its absence until in 2002, new satellite surveys of the Mole Basin revealed an unexpected anomaly. At the center of the valley once known as San Lazaro appeared 12 concentric rings etched into the ground, each ring roughly 10 meters apart, perfectly symmetrical, radiating from a single rectangular depression. The photograph was taken at sunrise. By noon, the next satellite pass showed only plain soil. No topographic change could explain it. The coordinates were clear, the weather stable. The analyst in charge of reviewing the image, Maria de los Santos, then 27, downloaded a high-resolution copy for her personal study before the data was archived. That night, her notes began with a simple line: "Natural resonance shouldn't be this precise." She would become the last scientist to enter the valley willingly. When Dr. Maria de los Santos reached the coordinates, the road had already stopped existing. Beyond the last wooden sign, the asphalt unraveled into dry veins of clay and stone. The jeep she drove coughed dust until the air itself became opaque, folding light into something soft and uncolored. She parked when the terrain began to hum beneath the tires. Not noise, but pressure, like standing near an enormous heartbeat buried beneath the surface. Her field diary would later become a kind of confession. Day 1. The silence feels like altitude. air-thin, metallic taste on tongue. Compass flickers northeast every 3 seconds. Day 2. No wind at all. Temperature constant. Measured faint vibration in ground. 1 pulse every 10 seconds. No seismic reading nearby. Day 3. Heard whispering outside tent. Not language, like breath moving through reeds. Could not sleep. Day 4. Something breathing below the soil. The dust shifts inward as if drawn by lungs. Cannot explain. Her handwriting, steady in the first pages, began to break apart halfway through the 4th entry. Pressure points darker, letters uneven. The last note on that page read, "There are doors here that are not built of wood." From that point, her voice on the field recorder replaces the diary. The recovered tapes run for just over 3 hours, though most of it is silence punctuated by faint inhalations. At the 70-minute mark, a rhythmic tone enters the background. It's low, deep, a pulse that feels less like sound and more like movement inside the chest. She says softly, almost apologetically, "If I stop breathing, I think I can hear theirs." The following segment is corrupted, but audio engineers manage to restore fragments of her speech. "They're in the air. No, under it. Like sound caught in glass. It's pulling the dust inward. Not wind, something drawing in. I think it's remembering." Then the recorder clicks twice and stops. When her colleagues in Santiago realized she hadn't checked in for 2 days, a recovery team was dispatched from Linares. They found the Jeep intact, key in ignition, battery drained. Her tent had been folded neatly and placed in the vehicle's rear compartment. A coffee cup sat on the ground beside it, the surface of the liquid perfectly still despite the evening breeze. They assumed she'd wandered into the hills, but there were no footprints. The soil retained no impressions, as if pressure no longer left marks. Inside the tent, they found the recorder still on, its reels spinning soundlessly, the tape having reached its end long ago. When they rewound and played it back, there was no trace of her voice. Only the hum, steady, patient, cyclic. 10 seconds in, 10 seconds out. The tape was taken to Santiago for analysis. Technicians slowed it by factors of 10, searching for patterns, and discovered that beneath the oscillation, a modulation formed what looked like a harmonic ladder. Sub-frequencies nested inside one another like Russian dolls. One of them, a young engineer named Serrano, isolated the lowest layer and enhanced it until the waveform became distinct enough to read as human phonemes. The word repeated was abajo, below. He replayed it in the lab several times. Each time, the speakers emitted a fine dust that hadn't been there before, reddish, metallic smelling, warm to the touch. Serrano wrote in his log, "Magnetized residue, possible ferric oxide contamination." But the note at the bottom of the page, handwritten, read, "The waveform breathes when I look at it." He resigned the following week, citing auditory fatigue. Dr. De Los Santos's camera card was corrupted, but data recovery specialists managed to restore a single frame. It showed the valley at dusk, taken from the ridge where her tent had been pitched. Under infrared filters, faint silhouettes appeared, dozens of human-shaped figures arranged in a wide circle around the rectangular depression. They were translucent, their edges soft, each facing outward from the center. When technicians enhanced the contrast, details of the bodies emerged. Ribs slightly expanded, torsos tilted as if caught mid-inhale. The Institute's archivist who received the image refused to catalog it. She wrote a short message to her supervisor. "We are looking at them the moment before they exhale." The file was sealed as Anomaly Delta 14, labeled Non-Corroborated Phenomenon, Region 7, and stored in the ministry's restricted archive. Only a handful of people ever read it. One of them, a physicist who assisted in the tape restoration, left a note on his desk before disappearing during a research trip to Valparaiso. Every 10 seconds, the waveform repeats. It's not feedback, it's respiration. He underlined the last word twice. That same winter, satellites mapping the Mole Basin recorded minute variations in barometric pressure centered precisely on the coordinates of San Lazaro. The pattern formed a spiral, 12 rings expanding and contracting by fractions of a millibar. The sequence lasted 100 seconds, then stopped. The report concluded with a single sentence, stripped of emotion, sterile and clinical. No meteorological cause determined. But inside the weather office, one analyst who reviewed the charts later told a colleague, it looked like the sky was breathing. When the recording of Dr. Maria de los Santos reached the network archive. It circulated quietly among researchers who worked with atmospheric resonance, signal decay, and infrasonic interference. Most dismissed it as data corruption. Some listened twice, frowned, and refused to comment. But one man requested access to the raw files. A retired acoustician named Dr. Gabriel Iñárritu, who had spent 40 years studying low-frequency sound patterns in confined environments. He lived alone in a house above Valparaiso Bay, his windows sealed against the salt wind, his shelves filled with magnetic reels labeled in pencil. He told the archivist who sent him the files that he didn't expect to find ghosts, only resonance. But ghosts, he said, often started as resonance. The first thing he noticed was structure. Beneath the static hum of Maria's field recording lay a pattern that was too clean to be accident. A modulation that repeated at 10-second intervals, with each pulse consisting of two distinct amplitudes, an inhale and an exhale. He plotted the waveform on paper, each rise and fall forming a shape uncannily organic. It looked like lungs. He slowed the recording by a factor of 10, then 20. At x40 speed reduction, the waveform ceased to sound like vibration. It became phrasing. 3 syllables, always the same. Respira abajo, breathe below. He played it again, this time through an oscilloscope that translated the sound into light. The pattern unfolded as concentric rings moving outward from a central point. He recognized it immediately, the same geometry seen in the 2002 satellite photograph of San Lazaro. He wrote in his notebook, "They are the same. The valley and the sound share a geometry." He began to suspect that the sound wasn't an echo, but an emitter, that the air itself, trapped within that basin, functioned as a living resonant cavity. He calculated the valley's size against the recorded frequency, 0.6 Hz. The numbers matched almost perfectly. The valley was tuned like an instrument. That realization should have frightened him. Instead, it fascinated him. He began recording his own breathing, feeding it through filters, layering it against the valley's pulse. He noted that after several hours of exposure, his own respiration began to mimic the recorded intervals. 10 seconds in, 10 seconds out. When he tried to stop, it hurt, as if his lungs were bound to something larger that demanded synchronization. His assistant found him one night standing in front of the speakers, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in time with the playback. The air around him shimmered slightly, a faint distortion like heat above asphalt. He turned and smiled. "Do you hear it?" he asked. "It's not sound, it's instruction." From that night on, he refused to leave his lab. Neighbors reported a low hum audible through the walls, constant, rhythmic, patient. When police entered the house weeks later, they found the sound still looping through a set of worn speakers. Dr. Iñárritu was gone. On his desk lay a final reel labeled "Synchronization Test. Do not play." The authorities handed it to the ministry's archive. A technician disobeyed the warning and played it once. The tape began with silence. Then a slow, deliberate breath filled the room, mechanical at first, then human. It lasted exactly 100 seconds. At the end, a voice, faint, familiar, whispered, "We're still beneath you." The technician vomited into a trash bin. He said the whisper had come from behind him, not the speaker. The ministry sealed the reel. But even sealed, it continued to emit a low hum, audible only at night, only if the building was quiet. They moved it twice. The sound followed. In 2006, a new generation of researchers reopened the Delta 14 archive. Among the files was a hard drive containing all previous recordings, Maria's, Iñárritu's, and others. The storage device was outdated, but one of the analysts, a graduate student named Rafael Pinto, managed to recover fragments. Most were unreadable, but one video file survived. It was labeled simply Valley Feed 1 AVI. The footage began with static, then the gray outline of hills under a fogged lens. The camera shook slightly. Rafael's own voice appeared in the background, nervous, whispering to another unseen person. "I think this is where she stood." He walks forward, breathing audible, slow. The camera pans down to the soil, dry, cracked, marked with faint concentric rings. As he speaks, the microphone catches a distant tone, the same 0.6 Hz pulse. He freezes. "It's still here." The frame vibrates subtly. The fog behind him begins to ripple inward, not outward, as though the air were inhaling. The wind doesn't move. Dust lifts in spirals from the ground, forming patterns too deliberate to be natural. He whispers something. It's breathing. The footage cuts to black. Raphael's car was found near the Mall Ridge 2 days later, half buried in silt. His phone was recovered nearby, screen shattered but intact. Its last recording showed him standing in thick mist, whispering, "They're not gone. It's us." Then the video ends abruptly. The incident was never reported publicly. The footage entered the same ministry archive under the same label, Anomaly Delta 14. 3 months later, a janitor in the same building was found unconscious beside the cabinet where the reels were kept. He survived, but when he woke, his breathing had changed. 10 seconds in, 10 seconds out. Exactly. By 2010, Anomaly Delta 14 had become an internal cautionary term inside the ministry, shorthand for unsolved and best left untouched. No one spoke the name San Lazaro aloud anymore. Technicians who processed atmospheric data simply referred to the region as the blank patch. The coordinates, once part of the Mall Basin grid, were filtered out of satellite updates. Whenever a new intern asked about the omission, the supervisor's answer was always the same: the data loops. Don't feed it back. But one man didn't believe in ghosts, nor in superstition masquerading as caution. Dr. Ignacio Valdez, a 70-year-old meteorologist from Talca University, was a man of formulas, a lifetime collector of small truths measured in decimals. When he came across a reference to Delta 14 in a declassified seismic bulletin, his curiosity sharpened. He requested access to the files under the guise of studying long-term barometric anomalies. No one objected. Bureaucracies forget faster than they forgive. He began with the oldest materials, the glass plate negatives from 1949, preserved in thick envelopes. They had been stored poorly, the gelatin cracked, the images fading to pale ghosts. He laid them one by one on a light table. Most showed the same view: houses, empty streets, the chapel. But when he examined them under infrared filters, a subtle pattern revealed itself. Thin circular ridges faintly visible on every frame, overlapping like ripples in water. He measured the distance between rings. Each one was separated by precisely 10 centimeters. He adjusted magnification, tracing each ring until the lines intersected. They converged in the same spot on every photograph: the chapel's foundation. He wrote in his notebook, "The air vibrates in intervals of 10. It is not pressure. It is memory expressed through resonance." He cross-checked the old data with meteorological logs from 2002, the same year of the concentric satellite image. The amplitude of pressure oscillation matched the spacing in the photographs. A perfect correlation. The pattern was impossible, yet self-consistent. A closed system repeating itself through decades. The next evening, Valdez brought the negatives home to re-examine them under different light conditions. He lived alone in a quiet suburb, surrounded by grapevines and old barometers. His workshop smelled of dust and lemon oil. He placed the slides against a wall and projected light through them, overlapping multiple frames. The circles aligned again, but this time he noticed something new. Within the center ring, faint discolorations formed a spiral, not flat but helical, twisting inward. He increased the brightness. The spiral pulsed. He blinked, thinking it was an illusion caused by his pulse in his eyes. But when he looked away, the pattern persisted, faint, rhythmic, almost imperceptible, but moving. He turned off the projector. The spiral continued glowing for a few seconds, independent of the light source. He wrote later that night, his handwriting unsteady. Light lingers in the pattern, possibly phosphorescent residue. My breathing feels synchronized with the flicker. The following week, he submitted a formal request to the ministry for a field visit to confirm his findings. No response came, so he went alone. He arrived at the valley on June 23, 2011. The dirt road was barely visible, the railway long rusted into the earth. The wind carried a smell of iron. The valley floor was bare, its surface pale and smooth, the texture of salt crust. He unpacked a small anemometer, a microphone, and his camera. Everything behaved normally for the first hour. The readings were consistent, the silence ordinary. Then, at 15:10, his recorder picked up a faint pulse. 10 seconds. Pause. 10 seconds again. He felt it before he heard it. A slow contraction in the chest. an invisible hand pressing inward. His own heartbeat began to follow it unconsciously, aligning with each cycle. He tried to speak into the recorder, but the air pushed back, thick as water. His voice came out lower than he intended, stretched by pressure. He turned toward the center of the valley. The ground shimmered faintly, dust rising in thin vertical lines like steam. He walked closer, camera held at his chest. The shimmer intensified. The horizon seemed to bend slightly, curving toward him. He stopped when he noticed the footprints. Dozens of them, human, bare, perfectly preserved in the powdery soil, all facing outward in a wide circle. He photographed them methodically, moving clockwise. Then, as he reached the final quarter of the circle, he realized the outermost prints were his own. The pulse in his ears grew louder. The dust at his feet began to move, inward, spiraling toward the center depression, drawn as if by slow breath. He stumbled back, but the air felt elastic, resisting motion. A low vibration filled his teeth. He dropped the camera. The final image recovered from the device showed the ground at his feet, dust lifting in thin streams, forming a lattice of fine rings expanding from where he stood. His car was found 2 days later by a passing survey team. The keys were still in the ignition, the engine cold. Inside the passenger seat, his notebook lay open. The last entry, written in small letters, read, "The valley is not empty. It inhales." He was never located. Months later, when analysts reviewed the recording device retrieved from his pack, they discovered the same hum looping in the background. But in the final 30 seconds, another sound appeared. A faint exhalation followed by a voice whispering in Spanish, "No olvides respirar." Don't forget to breathe. For 7 months, the disappearance of Dr. Ignacio Valdés remained classified as individual misadventure. No press coverage, no public record. His notebook, camera, and recorder were sealed with the rest of the Delta 14 materials. The file was stamped closed in red ink, though the ink had bled across the paper, the word fading into a shadow of itself. But absence, like sound, never truly disappears. It reverberates. And by 2012, the reverberation had found its way into the world. It began with the weather stations. Several civilian monitors across southern Chile reported simultaneous malfunctions in pressure sensors. Each station's barometer began oscillating, rising and falling in identical 10-second cycles. The readings persisted for 6 days. Technicians from the meteorological service blamed humidity, then dust, then solar interference. None of the explanations held. At 02:10 on the 7th day, every affected station went offline for exactly 100 seconds. When they returned, each had recorded the same data entry, in the same timestamp, though no human had typed it. Above must breathe below. The systems were not connected. Satellite imaging was launched to determine interference sources. The first photograph showed the valley of San Lázaro completely unchanged, flat, barren, colorless. The second, taken precisely 10 seconds later, revealed a geometric shadow, 12 rings of darkness spiraling inward. Within the innermost ring, a faint rectangle, the chapel's shape, pulsed with a measurable difference in temperature. That night, power grids across the mall region fluctuated, lights dimming in rhythmic intervals. People complained of headaches, chest pressure, and vivid dreams. A truck driver on Route 5 recorded a video on his phone of what he thought was a heat mirage, waves rising from the asphalt in even pulsing patterns. In the background, the cab's radio emitted a faint hum every 10 seconds. By the third night, hospitals began admitting patients with identical symptoms: shallow breathing, low heart rate, and a persistent sense of air heaviness. Doctors attributed it to seasonal air inversion. But when one nurse noticed that several unconscious patients were inhaling and exhaling at identical intervals, exactly 6 breaths per minute, she wrote the observation on a form, and the hospital's network crashed 5 seconds later. The local government denied any connection. The valley was never mentioned. In September of that same year, a private research satellite owned by a European Climate Institute captured high-resolution infrared scans of the Mall Basin. The imagery showed no human activity within 50 kilometers. Yet in the thermal spectrum, faint heat signatures appeared, arranged in a ring around the coordinates of San Lázaro. Each signature matched the outline of a standing human body. all facing outward, evenly spaced. The sequence lasted 10 minutes. Then the entire region cooled by 4 degrees, as if exhaling. The institute attempted to contact Chilean authorities. The email bounced. Months later, a journalist named Lucia Fernandez, who had once been a student of Dr. Valdez, began working on a long-form investigation titled The Village That Slept for 10 Days. She found the case buried under unrelated weather reports, its references fragmented across decades of bureaucratic forgetfulness. When she requested the Delta 14 archives, the ministry denied their existence. So she looked elsewhere. Through a retired technician, she obtained copies of Valdez's last notes, the ones found in his Jeep. She noticed something everyone else had missed. In the final paragraph, his handwriting changed, as if written by someone else. The letters were narrow, breathing between lines, and the last sentence read, "We are the echo of what breathes us." She didn't understand it, but it haunted her. Determined to reach the valley herself, Lucia planned a short expedition. 2 cameras, a drone, and a field recorder. She left Talca at dawn on November 3rd, 2012. Her GPS logged the entire route until 1623, when the signal began to distort. The coordinates froze for exactly 10 seconds, then resumed. 10 seconds later, they froze again. Her last transmission was a voice message sent to a colleague. The air feels organized, like it's thinking, then silence. The drone she launched hours earlier continued transmitting autonomously for 36 minutes. The footage it captured was later recovered by the colleague she'd left behind. At first, it shows the valley's surface from above, flat, colorless, unremarkable. Then, as the drone hovers, the dust begins to rise, forming faint lines, concentric, perfectly symmetrical. The rings expand outward, as if tracing an unseen breath. At minute 21, the camera captures movement. Not wind, not shadow, but distortion. The air folds inward. The image shakes. Through the interference, something appears in the center. Not an object, not light, but the absence of both. A rectangle darker than shadow, pulsing slowly. Then the drone's telemetry cuts out. When the footage ends, the final frame freezes mid-static, displaying an incomplete system message. AR below. Lucia's vehicle was found a week later, overturned near the Mall Ridge. No trace of her body. Her phone, recovered in the passenger seat, contained a single audio note created automatically by the recorder app, 49 minutes long. The waveform resembled a breath. When played back, the sound filled the room with a low hum, steady, living, eternal. The file was named by the device itself, day10.wav. By 2013, day10.wav had spread quietly through corners of the internet that specialized in anomalies, forums, audio restoration communities, experimental sound archives. No one knew where it came from. Some said it was part of an art project. Others claimed it was military sonar. But every person who downloaded it noticed the same thing. Their playback devices began to malfunction. The file was small, barely a few megabytes, yet it behaved like something alive. When opened in an editor, the waveform showed a smooth, symmetrical rhythm, a steady rise and fall every 10 seconds. Users who tried to cut or slow it found that the waveform corrected itself, realigning automatically to its original timing. The first reports were minor, laptops freezing, fans accelerating without cause. Then came the physiological effects. Listeners began describing a dull ache behind the sternum, a pressure in the chest that intensified with each repetition of the tone. Some reported dizziness, mild euphoria, or an overwhelming urge to take deep, synchronized breaths. One audio engineer claimed that after an hour of analysis, the waveform began to anticipate his input, the cursor moving on its own, aligning itself with the hum. He recorded his desktop as evidence. In the video, at exactly the 10-second mark, the cursor pauses. Then, without touch, it types a single word into the command bar, below. Within weeks, the file vanished from mainstream platforms, removed by moderators citing automated corruption issues. But it continued to circulate privately, renamed, embedded, disguised. People began to notice the side effects extending beyond the audio itself. One user in Argentina reported that his room lights dimmed in sync with the tone, even when the device was unplugged. Another, in Germany, said her voice started to echo faintly seconds after speaking. A perfect replica delayed by 10 seconds. A researcher in Japan, fascinated by the phenomenon, played Day10.wav through a subsonic amplifier and recorded the results on a thermal camera. The air temperature rose and fell with the waveform. He wrote in his notes, "The sound is not vibration. It is breath made visible." Then he uploaded the results. The video lasted 99 seconds before the channel disappeared, erased from its host servers without notice. Meanwhile, in Chile, the ministry's digital archive experienced a cascading failure. The Delta 14 repository, long disconnected from the public network, began generating new entries on its own. Automated logs showed file creations every 10 seconds, each labeled sequentially. Inhale 001 WAV. Exhale 001.wav. Inhale 2 WAV. Exhale 2.wav. No data inside, only metadata timestamps precisely 10 seconds apart. Security analysts investigating the breach noticed that, while inside the archive, their workstation fans synchronized, spinning up and slowing down in perfect unison with the entries. When they shut down the machines, the fans continued to pulse, powered by nothing. The technicians left the building. None returned to their stations afterward. A week later, seismic sensors across the mall region registered microfluctuations, oscillations too rhythmic for tectonic activity. They measured at exactly 0.6 Hz. The same pattern detected in 1949, in 1973, in 2002. The same breath returning. By early 2014, locals began to speak of La Aliento del Valle, the valley's breath. They said you could feel it if you stood on the ridge at dawn, a soft pull inward, like air being drawn through invisible lungs beneath the ground. Birds avoided the area. Water puddles on the valley floor rippled every 10 seconds, even on still days. No one stayed long. One evening in May, a film crew from Santiago arrived to shoot a documentary about Chilean ghost towns. They never mentioned San Lazaro by name, only the forgotten place near Mall. They set up equipment at sunset. By midnight, they had filmed enough to pack. When they returned to the hotel in Talca, they discovered that all 27 minutes of footage were blank. Only one frame remained. It showed a group of 5 people standing in a wide circle, their bodies blurred, translucent, as if caught mid-movement. Between them, a column of air appeared slightly darker than the rest, an indentation in the atmosphere, visible yet impossible. One crew member swore that, while reviewing the footage, the image seemed to move, not forward, but inward, collapsing toward the center. He quit filmmaking that week. Government agencies resumed silence. Files disappeared. The ministry building where Delta 14 had been stored was eventually demolished under the pretext of structural risk. Witnesses said the demolition equipment malfunctioned repeatedly, the cranes stalling every 10 seconds, their engines choking in rhythm. When the dust cleared, the workers reported a smell of iron. One of them later told a journalist that, while cleaning debris, he found a single sheet of paper, half-burned, folded twice. On it, written in uneven black ink, "It has learned to breathe without us." By then, the hum was no longer confined to recordings. It had become an ambient presence, faint, everywhere, always just below hearing. Some nights, when the wind dropped across central Chile, entire towns swore the air itself exhaled. Children woke crying, saying they dreamed of dust rising and people standing still with their eyes open, breathing together. And always, every 10 seconds, the silence returning to start again. There are valleys that do not age. They do not erode or collapse or vanish beneath the weight of time. They simply continue, the way a held breath continues in the chest of a sleeping body, waiting to be released. San Lazaro became one of those places. By 2020, its coordinates no longer existed in any government database. The valley was a blank on every chart, a white seam in the map's paper where the lines refused to meet. And yet, the absence could still be found. Truck drivers spoke of a pressure in their ears when passing the Mall Ridge. Local farmers said their dogs avoided the eastern fields, as if hearing something no human could. Weather balloons drifted off course, their altimeters pulsing like heart monitors. No one mentioned its name anymore, but every so often, when the fog descended over the basin, someone would say they heard breathing, slow, calm, collective. In a quiet district of Santiago, the remains of the Delta 14 archive were stored in a private warehouse purchased by a technology firm that had inherited the government's unused data servers. A small team of engineers was tasked with digitizing the physical media. They didn't know what the archive contained. Among the crates, one box stood out, older, heavier, sealed with wax. Its label, Region 7th, Atmospheric Irregularities, San Lazaro. Inside were the original reels, Maria's camera, Valdez's recorder, the cracked negatives from 1949, and buried beneath the documents, a small glass jar half filled with reddish dust. Someone had written on its lid in black marker, "Do not open near audio equipment." The lead technician, Mateo Reyes, was curious. He placed the jar beside his monitor and began scanning the documents. Each photograph rendered cleanly until one, a close-up of the chapel door, appeared blurred, vibrating subtly, as though the pixels were trying to breathe. The scanner jammed. A hum rose from the machine. 10 seconds in, 10 seconds out. He unplugged it. The sound continued. His coworker thought it was interference from the air conditioning unit, but the pulse was too slow, too patient. When the technicians opened the CPU case, they found the cooling fans spinning on and off in perfect intervals, synchronized to the hum. One of them leaned closer to listen. He swore he heard words forming beneath the rhythm, whispered through static. "Wake up! Wake up!" They sealed the room and left the building. The hum lingered. A week later, a power outage rolled through Santiago's industrial district. Traffic lights flickered, servers rebooted, the grid oscillated. Every 10 seconds, the city exhaled. Security cameras captured the blackout. On the footage, dust from demolished buildings rose and fell rhythmically, as if the entire city were breathing. When the lights returned, monitors across the district displayed the same system error. AR below synchronized. No one could trace the source. No central server existed. The message had come from within the machines themselves. Months passed. The hum persisted only at the edge of perception. A low vibration felt more than heard. People adjusted without realizing. Sleep patterns shifted subtly. Heart rate slowed by fractions of a second. Breaths deepened unconsciously. Across the mall region, respiration statistics aligned with a new median, 6 per minute. It was subtle, silent, collective, a slow synchronization of life. In 2021, a graduate student studying psychophysiology at the University of Concepcion ran a nationwide analysis of circadian breathing rhythms. Her conclusion was small, buried in an appendix of data tables. All participants between the ages of 6 and 80 display spontaneous synchronization of respiration during non-REM sleep. The cycle averages 10.0 seconds per phase. She marked it as statistically irrelevant. There is no monument to San Lazaro, no road sign, no ruin, only the space where sound once folded the world into itself. But on some dawns, when the air is still, you can feel it. A faint pressure against the lungs, the valley remembering. Not as legend, not as warning, but as continuity. Because memory does not live in stone or dust or silence. It lives in rhythm, and rhythm, once learned, never leaves the body. Some nights, across Chile, radios pick up a faint pulse at the edge of the AM band. It hums softly, 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off. Technicians say it's interference from power lines, but those who listen closely say the hum breathes. If you match your breathing to it, slowly, patiently, you might feel the air tighten, as if the valley has noticed you. Then, in the pause that follows, something exhales, and in that silence between breaths, for a single, impossible moment, the world forgets to wake.